Good evening, students. Today we're going to be talking about the post-war uncertainty in the years after World War I. Please use the essential question, how did the post-war period demonstrate the loss and uncertainty created during the war, but also led to creativity and innovation? Use the essential question to guide your focused note-taking. I want you to look at the societal changes that took place in the years after World War I. Please pay attention to or to new philosophies that were created during this time, and please use the essential question to summarize your notes at the end. Thank you very much, and enjoy. The first thing that we're going to discuss today is new ideas in science. So the first and most important one is the idea of Einstein's theory of relativity. This offered a radically new idea in the field of physics. The theory of relativity is the idea that space and time are not constant. New ideas like this make the world seem like a more uncertain place than before. The way that his idea worked was that space and time were only relative to the person experiencing them. This is why if you're sitting in the back of a car traveling at 35, 40 miles an hour, you can throw a piece of paper and hit the driver in the back of the head with it without throwing the piece of paper 40 miles an hour. Another new important idea in science was the field of psychology influenced by Sigmund Freud. He created new ideas about the mind, and he claimed that human behavior is not based on reason, but on the ideas of development, and that people get stuck in certain stages of life or they progress through them, and if they get stuck, then they don't become a full actualized human being. This is also the idea that people's actions could possibly be shaped by their experiences and the trauma that they experience in life. The other major influence of the war was in the world of literature, specifically the coining of the term lost generation. Now, the lost generation came from the idea that World War I caused such great suffering that people began to doubt old ideas and old beliefs. Many of the younger writers that coined this term lost generation were World War I veterans. Specifically, Ernest Hemingway, who fought as an ambulance driver for the French army. His experience in war would shape him greatly, leading him to be a terrible alcoholic, but would also write about the pain that was experienced by the soldiers in the war. The idea that they were lost is that they fought for something that didn't actually exist. They fought for something that they couldn't really put their fingers upon. Other important authors of the Lost Generation were T.S. Eliot, who wrote in his famous poem, The Wasteland, that the traditional values of the world had been destroyed by the war and that left in its place were wasted individuals that had nothing left to live for. Another great example of Lost Generation writing is F. Scott Fitzgerald and his book, The Great Gatsby. In The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald writes about a generation of people that are consumed with materialism and wealth, only to just basically destroy and throw away lives of the people that are around him that are less fortunate, and that this is the idea of the American dream. This frustration with the world and the wealthy is borne out in two great quotes in The Great Gatsby. The first one is about Tom and Daisy Buchanan, two of the protagonists of the book, where they say, "They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures, and then they retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess that they had made." The idea behind this quote is basically that the wealthy, just like countries involved in the war, could destroy things and they had nothing to happen to them, where the people had to pick up the pieces. Outside of literature, the art world was also forever changed. Prior to the war, people focused on realistic scenes, but after the war, they changed to ideas of cubism, which transforms natural shapes into geometric forms, Dadaism, which is a reject of reason and logic, prizing nonsense and anarchy, and Surrealism, which is an art movement that links the dream world to real life to make what happens in our heads a reality. One of the major inventors of Cubism was Pablo Picasso. Please take a little minute and just check out all the Cubist paintings, record the titles, and a brief idea of what you think of them. The next art style we're going to look at is Dadaism. Dadaism sought to take normal things and put them into ludicrous ideas. This is essentially just kind of making nonsense of the idea that art is supposed to be taken seriously. As you'll see on our next slide, how ridiculous Dadaism was. Please take a look at each one of them and record who created the art as well as what you believe it is supposed to describe. Enjoy the next slide. Urinals can be art. Dadaism included several different styles of art, including collages, photo montages, as well as sculpture, and just using ready-made products as art. Surrealism was a style of art that was popularized by Salvador Dali, a Spanish painter, and the idea was meant that you would access your subconscious and you would bring it into reality. It would focus on sort of the weird nature or the surreal aspect of life of your dream world and try to make that real. Ideas of making you second guess what you were seeing and what you were experiencing, such as persistent memory, the Salvador Dali above. Teenagers live in a surreal world, always making you second guess everything that you know that is concrete, such as the painting above that is saying that that is not a pipe, when you truly know it is. One of the other most impactful new styles of art was in the music scene, and that was with jazz. Jazz basically was a less or a more loose flowing style, less complicated style of music that did not focus on the rules of classical music, that allowed the musician to truly express themselves and to do what they were feeling at the moment. Probably the most noted and most famous of jazz musicians is Louis Armstrong, and jazz is a particularly American phenomenon. Was one of the few fine arts that America has given to the rest of the world. Originating in New Orleans in the American South, jazz, along with its cousin, blues, quickly spread throughout the rest of the world, influencing, amongst other things, rock and roll. Now, with all this new art and all this new entertainment, other things were changing too. Specifically, women's roles in society. Women would take on new roles during the war, such as working in factories and running businesses, and they parlayed this new skills in their right to vote within 1919. In the 1920s, women would adopt new hairstyles and freer clothes, such as the bob right above, and these women would be known as flappers. Flappers for the style of dress that they would wear that would flap around when they would dance at nightclubs, something that women in previous generations were not allowed nor permitted to do. As you can see, flappers were known for their awesome styles, particularly and most important, the short skirt, which was just to the knee instead of the ankle, and short hair. This clothing was much more revealing than anything that society had seen previously, but this is what happens as women gain their own rights and are not seen as property of their husbands or fathers anymore. Another huge change was that women were starting to smoke and drink alcohol in public, something that had never previously been permitted. Outside of style, probably the biggest impact on people's lives was the availability of the automobile. Cars were improved after the war with technology that was created during the war. Cars became less expensive, which meant ownership became increased. Increased auto use would change people's lives, allowing them to live further from cities and be able to travel around the country with much greater ease. The second technology that would improve our lives was the airplane. During the war, airplanes became readily used for scouting missions and eventually in combat roles as well. By the end of the war and by the 30s, technology would improve so much that it would allow for transatlantic flights, which would shorten the time to get from Europe to the United States from 2 weeks on a boat all the way down to about 2 days or a little bit less, which would allow people to move from continent to continent much quicker. Now, the most famous aviator of the time was Charles Lindbergh, with Amelia Earhart coming in a close second. Outside of the car, probably the most important advancements in technological history at the time were the mass communication devices of radios and movies. Radios would allow people to communicate with each other, or governments to communicate with their people, as well as broadcasting things like ball games and plays and the news directly into people's homes, allowing for mass communication, as well as silent pictures, which would become a major industry and art form in the years after World War I, literally creating the city of Los Angeles as we know it. These are three of the biggest silent grossing films of the time. The most important one is The Birth of a Nation, which unfortunately is about the greatness of the Ku Klux Klan and at one time was screened by President Woodrow Wilson at the White House. It is a travesty of a movie demonstrating how great the Ku Klux Klan was. However, because of speaking for the time, it was, like I said, screened by the president at the White House. Thank you for listening. Please summarize your notes answering the question, how did the post-war period demonstrate the loss and uncertainty created during the war, but also lead to creativity and innovation? Thank you, and we will discuss this tomorrow.